Hey, thanks so much for joining us here on 9 News Plus. I'm Chris Bianchi. Today we got a special guest to discuss the upcoming lunar eclipse that's going to take place this weekend. And for more on how you can see it, and for a bit more on all of that, we're now joined by Hranac, a spokesperson and a past president of the Denver Astronomical Society. Ron, thank you so much for taking the time to join us here on
You're
9 News
welcome,
Plus
Chris.
today.
You're welcome, and thanks for having me. Glad to be here, and be glad to answer any questions that I can.
Well, we've definitely got quite a few of those questions. I'll start things off with a bit of a basic overview for those of us who might not know the details of what exactly a lunar eclipse is and also how common they are.
Well, lunar eclipses are fairly common, much more so than many people might think, but they happen during a full moon phase. They can't happen any other time. And what happens is, as the moon goes around the Earth, and if it happens to be aligned just right with the Earth's shadow, which is being cast into space, then we'll see a lunar eclipse. So think of the alignment of the sun, the Earth, and the moon such that the sunlight is lighting up the other side of the Earth, and we're of course, on the nighttime side of the planet. And then the moon is passing through the Earth's shadow that is being cast into space. So that's a lunar eclipse. And as I mentioned, they are fairly common. On average, lunar eclipses can occur 2 or 3 times a year, sometimes more, sometimes fewer than that, but on average, a couple times a year, someplace in the world. For a given location, let's say like the Colorado Front Range, and this goes back to the on average comment again, we can expect to see a lunar eclipse here about every 2.5 years. But sometimes that average is not necessarily what really happens, because there was a lunar eclipse last year in May of 2021. Unfortunately, it was not at a particularly convenient time, like the one coming up on Sunday, May 15th. That one happened between midnight and sunrise. So it was one of those set your alarm clock and get up to see it if you can. And unfortunately, there were some thin clouds that got in the way for many and diminished the view. There's going to be another lunar eclipse later this year on November 8th, but it's going to be another one of those set your alarm clock and get up at oh dark 100, so well after midnight. I think that one peaks at about 4 a.m., but the one coming up Sunday night is at a more convenient time, a little later in the evening, but still convenient for most people to get outside and see it.
Yeah, so if you could give us some more details on what time exactly it'll take place. I know there's also kind of an inner window where there's a bit of an extra good time to check out the lunar eclipse. Is that right?
Well, that's true. Lunar eclipses have different phases, as you might imagine, because the Earth's shadow has a couple different components. There's part of the shadow that's the fainter part called the penumbra, and then the darker part of the Earth's shadow is called the umbra. So we have the penumbral and umbral parts of the eclipse. But I'll get away from the technical terms. Well, to a certain extent. The penumbral eclipse begins Sunday night at about 7:30 p.m., actually around at 7:32 p.m. We won't be able to see the start of the penumbral phase because the moon will still be below the horizon. However, moonrise occurs at 3 minutes before 8 p.m. Mountain Time, Sunday. So folks will need to be looking toward the southeast, and it's important to have an unobstructed view of the southeast horizon in order to see it as it comes up. So the partial phase begins not long after moonrise at 8:27 p.m., so roughly half an hour later. When the partial phase of the lunar eclipse begins Sunday night, the moon's going to be fairly low on the horizon, only about 4 degrees above the horizon. Now, when I talk about degrees, think of the width of the moon. A full moon that you see in the sky is equal to a half a degree. So that would be the equivalent of 8 full moons stacked side by side from the horizon up to just above the horizon. Now, a simpler way to visualize that is to extend your arm, make a fist like this with the thumb on top and vertical like this. And as you hold your arm and fist out like this, place the bottom of the fist on the level horizon. The top of the thumb will be, it varies somewhat among people, but will be approximately 10 degrees. So what that means is that when the partial phase begins, the moon will be about half a fist width above the southeastern horizon. The total phase begins a little bit later at 9:29 p.m., and that's what I think most people will be interested in. That's when we get to see what's commonly called the blood moon. Maximum eclipse is 11 minutes after 10 p.m., and then the total phase ends at 10:53 p.m., so starting to get a little bit late, almost 11 o'clock. Then the partial phase ends at 11:55. And for the real hardcore folks that want to stay up and maybe do some photography, the penumbral phase ends at 12:50 a.m. However, a penumbral phase of a lunar eclipse is really pretty boring. There's not much to see. It's very, very difficult to see any change in brightness with the naked eye. But the partial phase and the total phase, those are the parts that people are most interested in.
So it seems like between about 9 and 11 will be the prime time, if I'm getting that. When we're at the peak, the time there, how high, you mentioned how at the beginning, the partial eclipse will be about 4 degrees above the horizon. How high will it be when we're talking about the peak times between about 9:30 and 11 on Sunday?
When the total phase begins, the moon will be about 13 degrees above the horizon, and it'll be a little over 18 degrees above the horizon during the maximum part of the eclipse. And that's usually high enough to clear most obstructions, unless somebody's right next to a tall building or something, or has a lot of really tall trees nearby. But the main thing to do is to get out where we have a relatively unobstructed view toward the southeast, and things should work out. It may be a little rough when the partial phase begins, since the moon will be fairly low, but depending on one's location, if you get up high enough, it should be fairly easy to see.
Great information there, Ron. And this weekend's lunar eclipse, you mentioned this, it's a blood moon lunar eclipse. What does that mean? And is that kind of an extra special type of lunar eclipse?
Well, the name blood moon refers to a total eclipse in general. And the name comes from the color of the moon. And the color of the moon during the total phase of a lunar eclipse can vary depending on a variety of factors. But the pinkish reddish color occurs when sunlight, remember, coming from the other side of the Earth, refracts through the Earth's atmosphere. So if you could imagine being on the moon looking back at the Earth toward the sun, with the sun directly behind the moon, the Earth's atmosphere would look like this little reddish ring. So think of a sunset effect all around the circumference of the moon, and that's caused by the refraction of sunlight through the Earth's atmosphere. The color of the eclipse depends on, to a large extent, the amount of dust and volcanic ash and other things in the Earth's atmosphere. There have been some years after a volcanic eruption where the color of a total phase of a lunar eclipse was blood red, I mean, really dark red or really dark orange color. And other times it might only be a subtle shade of pink or a light orange. So it really depends to a large extent on what's in the Earth's atmosphere. We've had a lot of wind the last few weeks here in Colorado. Whether that's enough to stir up dust to affect the color of the moon remains to be seen, but one can always hope. But that's what the name refers to. It's a generic name for a total phase of a lunar eclipse.
Maybe one good thing from all that wind is that it makes the lunar eclipse coming up on Sunday maybe look a little bit more interesting. With that in mind, I also know that the Denver Astronomical Society is hosting an event coming up on Sunday night to mark the lunar eclipse. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
That's correct. Denver Astronomical Society will be hosting a no-cost open house event for the lunar eclipse Sunday night, May 15th, at the University of Denver's historic Chamberlain Observatory. DAS members are going to have telescopes and binoculars set up on the park lawn on the south side of the observatory building. And the public will be free to stop by and take a look through the scopes and binoculars. Of course, one can observe the lunar eclipse naked eye, but I think it looks a little nicer through a small telescope or through binoculars. People, of course, are encouraged to bring their own binoculars if they like. If they want to get comfortable during the eclipse, since it does last for a bit, bring a lawn chair or two and sit back and enjoy the view. The event itself is going to get started around 7:30. At least that's when we encourage people to show up. Parking is on the street only around Observatory Park in the neighborhood, so that's a first come, first served basis. But we encourage people to show up between 7:30 and 8:30 p.m. And as the moon rises and starts to poke up through the trees, we'll probably see maybe a little bit of the beginning of the partial phase as the moon comes up through the trees on the southeast side of the park. But once it's above the trees during the beginning of the total phase, we should be able to see that very, very easily. DU students will be on hand to provide some physics demonstrations. And I think it's going to be a lot of fun for folks. The weather forecast right now is looking good. And we encourage people to stop by and take advantage of the ability to take a look through scopes and binoculars.
Well, I'm a science nerd, so I'm certainly intrigued by that, and I'm sure plenty of you out there are as well. To check out the lunar eclipse coming up on Sunday night. Ron, any final takeaways, insights, things we should look for coming up on Sunday night with this lunar eclipse?
I think one thing I'd like to emphasize that it is safe to look at a lunar eclipse naked eye. You don't need any special filters or eclipse glasses or anything. That type of equipment is necessary for a solar eclipse, but a lunar eclipse, if you can look at the full moon with your naked eye, you're fine. It's just that the moon will be a little bit darker and hopefully a deeper shade of red or orange, depending on the colors. But nothing special required to observe the eclipse. You can do it naked eye. You can look at it with binoculars and even a telescope.
Well, that is fantastic. And Ron, we really appreciate your insight, your expertise, and the depth of your knowledge and explaining it so clearly to us here on 90s Plus. We really appreciate the minutes of your time here today.
Glad to help out, Chris, and thanks for having me on.
Ron Hranac, spokesperson and past president of the Denver Astronomical Society. Again, they'll be hosting that event coming up on Sunday night at the University of Denver. So once again, Ron, thank you so much again for joining us here on 90s Plus.
You're welcome.